Hello everyone, this is Masako Ganaha. Today I'm in Belgium and I'm going to interview worldly famous professor. I'm going to introduce him. Mattias Desmet, Professor Mattias Desmet. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Masako. Thank you for wanting to interview me, actually.
Thank you. And I watched many of your videos online, and you looked very friendly, and you're the same as what I see on the screen. And this year, you published a book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, you apply what's happening to our mind globally, the method of psychology, and we've been manipulated. And so today I would like to ask you many questions, and hopefully we can learn from you and protect our families and friends who are suffering currently. Okay. So first of all, could you please explain us why you decided to publish this book? You of course you wrote in this book, but if you could tell us what motivated you the most?
I can try to. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Michel Houellebecq, this famous French writer, who said in an interview 1 or 2 months ago or something, he said, "It seems to me that the human being is a mystery to itself." I mean, the human being doesn't know itself. We don't really know why we do the things we do, I think. And I also don't really know why I wrote the book I wrote. So, but I believe that, well, I was fascinated by the phenomenon of totalitarianism already much longer. I had, since 2017, something like that, I had the impression that we were witnessing the emergence of a new kind of totalitarianism here in the world. And exactly this kind of totalitarianism, what Hannah Arendt warned us for. She said in 1951, we've seen communist totalitarianism, we've seen fascist totalitarianism, but very soon, she said, we will see the emergence of a new kind of totalitarianism, a kind of totalitarianism which is not led by gang leaders such as Stalin and Hitler, but by dull bureaucrats and technocrats, meaning a technocratic totalitarianism. And I believe that's what's happening now. So from 2017 onwards, I noticed that the reaction to, the response to all kinds of objects of anxiety, such as terrorism or climate change, always went in the same direction. The only answer we seemed to have when we felt threatened, when the population felt threatened, was more technological control, more surveillance, and so on. At that moment, what we could see in our society was what Jacques Ellul, a French author who wrote a lot about propaganda, what Jacques Ellul calls the massification of society. It is as if people start more and more to react in a common anxiety-driven response. But at that moment we were not facing a full-fledged mass formation yet. The real mass formation happened first in the corona crisis. At that moment we saw something that is very typical for the beginning of all totalitarianism. The emergence of a specific group dynamic in society, a specific group dynamic which is so strong that it reorganizes all pre-existing social bonds. That means suddenly a new group forms, a new group that believes in a certain narrative, that very fanatically believes in it, and the dividing line between this new group and all the rest of the people runs straight through every pre-existing group, through every family, company, through political parties, through friendships. Suddenly, when a mass formation emerges, all pre-existing groups are split in two, and the only question that matters from then on is, yes, but to which group do you belong? Do you believe in the narrative, or do you not believe in the narrative? And that's what we have observed for the first time in the corona crisis. The terrorism, the war on terror, for instance, didn't lead in the same way. It didn't lead to a mass formation. The first time that we saw the emergence of a full-fledged mass formation was the corona crisis, with these two new groups in which suddenly friends who knew each other since they were young suddenly found themselves in opposite camps and suddenly became enemies. That's typical for a mass formation, and that's also the beginning of totalitarianism. A totalitarian system is always based on mass formation. That's the big difference with the classical dictatorship. In a classical dictatorship, to put it in simple words, there is a small group of people, a dictatorial regime, who has a huge aggressive potential. The population is scared of that small group, and it accepts that this small group imposes unilaterally its social contract to society. That's what happens in a classical dictatorship. It's just fear of the aggressive potential of a group of people. In a totalitarian state, something completely different happens. First, there is the emergence of a mass which fanatically believes in a certain ideology, a certain narrative, and then there is an elite who uses the mass, who forms, like what Hannah Arendt called, a diabolic pact with the mass. Hannah Arendt said in her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, totalitarianism is always based on a diabolic pact between the elite and the masses. So this mass that believes fanatically in a certain narrative is manipulated by an elite or used by an elite to seize control of the state system, and at that moment a completely new kind of state emerges. A kind of state which just like a classical dictatorship controls public space and political space, but which also controls private space, because it has this huge secret police, namely this part of the population that so fanatically believes in the narrative that it wants to report everyone to the state who doesn't go along with the narrative. That's a famous characteristic of mass formation. Mass formation is a kind of group formation which has very specific effects at the level of individual mental functioning. For instance, people become radically incapable of seeing how absurd the beliefs become of the group they belong to. For instance, during the revolution in Iran in 1979, there was a huge mass formation, and people started to believe that the portrait of the Ayatollah, whom they considered to be their leader, was printed on the surface of the moon. And when there was a full moon in the sky, they typically pointed at the moon in the streets, showing each other where exactly you could see the portrait of the Ayatollah. That's one example of the absurdity of the beliefs in a mass formation. And the second characteristic is that people start to become radically willing to sacrifice everything that used to be important for them. Very strange. When they are in a mass formation, they are so much in the grip of a collective ideal, of a collective narrative, that they want to sacrifice everything that used to be important for them. Even their children or the health of their children doesn't matter. And a third very important characteristic is that they become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. Everyone who doesn't go along with the masses is excluded, stigmatized, and in the end destroyed. To give a very impressive example of that, also from the revolution in Iran, this woman I know who lived in Iran, she has seen with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state, and how she hung the rope around his neck on the scaffold. And when he was hung, she claimed to be a heroine for doing what she did. That's a typical end stage of mass formation, in which people start to commit atrocities, even towards the people they used to love very much, and they do so always as if it is their ethical duty to do so. So it's this kind of mass, this kind of group formation with these very characteristic effects and far-reaching effects at the level of individual psychological functioning that is the basis of totalitarianism, and that leads to this completely new kind of state that we call the totalitarian state.
Oh, it's frightening to see, hear what you describe, the state of the world we are living in. And one thing I recalled, I read a news a couple months ago from United States. There are ongoing unfair trial against the American people who are at the present on January 6th in DC. And I remember there is a son who reported to the authority about his father, and the father, he just couldn't believe what's happening to his lovely son, and still the father said, I just forgive my son. And so there is this tragedy, like sad family story, but You just said this is just the beginning, and it's happening, and yes. So you wrote this book to bring the awareness of what's happening, what's coming, and it's really sad beginning to hear this, but it's really important. And as I read this book, it's like why we do not learn this important stuff. And we see this movie 1984, and same things that George Orwell is warning us by his novel, but still there are many people who do not realize. So my next question is, what's the difference between the people who realize what's happening and the people who belongs to the narrative?
Nobody really knows. That question has been asked by almost every scholar who studied mass formation. Like every time a large-scale mass formation emerges, there is a certain group who is resilient, who doesn't participate, who doesn't fall prey to it, but nobody seems to really know what the characteristics of this group are. Probably it has to do with a kind of sensitivity, a kind of affinity with what I call truth speech, and what the ancient Greeks already called truth speech. Each time we express our opinion, we can choose to speak the words that a large group speaks, and we can go along with what the majority believes, or we can try to find out what, according to us, seems to be the most sincere and the most honest words, and then try to articulate these words. In that case, if we decide to speak out, even no matter what the consequences are, even if the group is angry with us, blames us, or even more, becomes aggressive towards us, in that case, we practice truth speech. I think some people do that more than other people. Some people always choose the easy way and always go along with what the majority does or thinks or says. Other people rather think for themselves and in one way or another choose the more difficult way, namely to stay true, to stay loyal to their own inner feeling of justice, to their own inner awareness of what is sincere and honest, and try to speak out in such a way that they can feel honest and sincere. And that's in one way or another, probably it's the second group, the group who tries to find its satisfaction not in belonging to the group, but in staying true to something, to certain ethical principles, for instance, that is more resilient when a mass formation emerges. That's my 2 cent worth opinion. But as I said, it's extremely hard to predict before a mass formation emerges which people will fall prey to it and which won't. If I, retrospectively speaking, if I look back now, I think that the people who didn't fall prey to it in my environment very often were the people that, in my opinion, were the most sincere people before. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You mean sincere meaning true to themselves?
Yes, and honest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I see. And before I watched one of the interviews, and you said you used to be in the past you didn't think that there was God, and then as you study and go into science, we realize that we as human we learn and we come to the conclusion that once what's said in the past is true. Could you please describe?
I come from a very religious family, but when I was about 14 or 15 years old, I was interested in the sciences. I was someone who tried to rationally understand the world, and while I didn't like it, I became convinced that there was no other possibility than that the entire universe was like a set of material elementary particles that interacted with each other according to the laws of mechanics that can be perfectly described in rationalist terms and entirely understood in a rational way, and that there was no God whatsoever. I had the feeling that where would God be? It's clear this entire universe in the end is a material phenomenon. And I didn't like this conclusion because I have a very mystical, intuitive component in myself. And I I didn't like the idea that there was no God, but still my rational thinking, and maybe I never really believed it, that there was no God, but my rational thinking told me, like, look, there is just no other possibility. If you look, the entire world is built up of molecules and atoms, and it's all interacting with each other according to the laws of mechanics. Where would God be in this universe? But very soon, and I'm really grateful for that, I started to follow the sciences, and I noticed that actually sciences itself, for instance, quantum mechanics is the most obvious example, shows us that these material particles actually are not what we believe they are. They react to our consciousness, they react to our thoughts and ideas and feelings, they react to our subjective experiences, they can be in two places at the same time, they behave in the most absurd and irrational ways. And that was my first step, and then the second one was when I dived deep into the mathematical basis of complex dynamical systems theory, which shows in a brilliant way, and also in a paradoxical way, it proves in a strictly rational way that the essence of most phenomena in nature is strictly irrational. So it shows that they behave, these complex dynamical phenomena, as irrational numbers. There is no periodicity in it. There is no way you can predict them. They are inherently, fundamentally unpredictable. And suddenly, I started to understand something. I suddenly started to become aware of the fact. I always thought that the facts, what we call the facts, and what we call reality, that of course everything behaves in a logical way. What would it do else than behaving in a logical way? How could it behave in an illogical way? But it is not logical, it's not rational. Nature is irrational. And then I started to understand what Niels Bohr meant when he said, when it comes to atoms, so Niels Bohr, the famous quantum physicist, who received the Nobel Prize for his contribution to quantum mechanics, he said, when it comes to atoms, language can only be used as poetry. There is no way rational language doesn't allow you to grasp the essence of the behavior of molecules and atoms. Only poetry, and he was dead serious when he said that, only poetic language or mystical language or religious language, according to some of the other quantum physicists, only a non-rational language, be it poetry, religion, or mystical discourse, can allow you to grasp something, to feel something of the essence of the nature of elementary particles. René Thom, one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century, said it in an even more beautiful way, I think. He said, this part of reality that can be understood in a rational way is very limited, and the rest of reality we can only understand by empathically resonating with it. So, we stumble upon the difference there between two kinds of knowledge. The first kind of knowledge is a rational knowledge. It's based on what our eyes can see and on logically connecting the facts that our eyes can observe. And that's what in French is called savoir. They use the word savoir. The French people have two words for knowledge, savoir and connaître. And if you interpret these words literally, savoir refers to voir, refers to what you can see with your eyes. It's knowledge that is based on what you can see with your eyes. Mm-hmm. And connaître is connaître, meaning to be born together. It's a kind of knowledge from a different level. It's a resonating knowledge. Also, I've been practicing martial arts for a long time, and the samurai culture in Japan also made this distinction. They said, like, if you learn an art, for instance the martial arts, there are always two stages. The first stage is a stage in which you learn technical rules which will tell you in a rational way what the art is and how you should practice the art. And then, but first you have to practice the techniques for a long time. But then, when you continue this technical training for a long time, you will slowly start to develop a different kind of knowledge, a kind of feeling, which is a resonating knowledge. You will start to feel what you have to do, as if you're resonating with what you want to do and what you want to obtain. And that's the second type of knowledge, this resonating knowledge, which is indicated by connaître in French, and not by savoir. And the samurai, they had this wonderful expression. They said, if you want to learn an art, you first have to protect the rules of the art and the techniques of the art, and then you have to break them. And it's at the moment you can break them and leave the techniques behind that you really become a master in the art. And they said, it's hard to learn the techniques of the martial arts, but it's even harder to forget them again. And if you don't succeed in forgetting them again, before you go to the battlefield, you will die on the battlefield. And that's so beautiful. That shows us that we all think here, since the emergence of the modern sciences in the West, we believe that the cornerstone of our human living together and of our human existence should be rational understanding, but it's not true. Rational understanding is very limited. It's the beginning of the phase of gathering knowledge, of knowing the world. It's first when you develop this resonating knowledge that you start to get in touch with the real, with what transcends all rational understanding. It's the moment where you start to feel in touch with the eternal principles of life, the eternal principles of nature, the eternal principles of humanity, and it are these principles that are the true basis of human living together. A society can never be based on rational understanding. It can only be based on awareness of ethical principles. Ethical principles which everyone, I think, should reinvent himself. If we just copy them from others, they become dogmas. We have to go through the learning process ourselves, get in touch with the real, with what transcends rational understanding, and then we will slowly be capable of articulating these ethical principles in our own way, and in that way it will really become our principles, and we will be able to live an authentic, original life without feeling I would say, without thinking that there is nothing we should listen to and that there is nothing we should obey. We all need a master, and these principles are the best master. Otherwise, there will be a totalitarian master who will tell us what to do. So I believe that. That's a major problem, I think, in our culture now, in our society now, that we have this delusional belief that rational understanding will solve our problems. It won't. Rational understanding is important. You have to go through the process of rationalization, but we always have to realize that the ultimate goal of rational understanding is to transcend it and to move on to a different way of understanding, which is more a resonating, empathic way.
Oh, I see. Your the discovery or this kind of the discussion makes me like remember the old saying. I think I don't know if it's old saying or not, but when you are little, you become like when you're young, you become communist. But you graduate communist and then you become something like maybe conservative or I don't know what opposite of communism. Then you are like a smart person or something. There was something like this.
It was Churchill, I think, who said something like that. If you are not a left-wing thinker when you're 18 years old, you have no heart. And if you're still left-wing thinker when you're 30 years old, you have no brains, he said. Something like that.
So the essence of what you taught me now is that we have to go for rational because we need teacher. But we should not stop here because it becomes dogma and kind of like a religion. But we have to go beyond it, and that's where we obtain one thing truly, and that's, in other words, you're saying resonate with things. That's how we. Yes. That's how the things go.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's what everyone who really becomes a master in a craft or an art experiences, and also what all the seminal scientists concluded. All seminal scientists concluded if you try to understand for a very long time a certain phenomenon in a rational way, you will notice that you can understand certain aspects of the phenomenon in a rational way, but at a certain moment there is a limit. At a certain moment, and you even can prove that in the sciences, that there is a limit beyond which rational understanding just doesn't exist anymore. But if you continue to try to rationally understand, you will never really grasp the object you try to understand, but you will circle around it and you will start to feel it. And that's the moment at which a certain resonating knowledge starts to develop. Like Max Planck, also a Nobel Prize winner in physics, said, I've been studying elementary particles my entire life in laboratory, and he said, I came to the conclusion that science ultimately arrives where religion once started, in a personal contact with that which transcends all rational understanding. And he said, and to be clear, he said, that which transcends all rational understanding for me is a personal God. Max Planck said that, a Nobel Prize winner, unbelievable. He said it was an act of bravery. He was extremely brave when he articulated these words in the academic world. Yeah.
I see. Once again, I realized that how important it is to realize there is things that beyond us. Like we are not omnipotent, we are not God, but people who tend to recline those ideology, they seek help for rational reason instead of the greater good. And I'd like to ask you next question. When we first met, we were talking, and I should have recorded your great conversation. So I wanted to introduce people what you taught me. So you're saying that this modern totalitarianism is led by technocrats in the form of digitalization. And could you please explain what is happening to us when we have conversation on videos or without meeting?
Yes.
What's really happening?
Well, I can explain what doesn't happen when you meet digitally. And I've been studying in-person, real conversations for 15 years with my research group at Ghent University. I audio tape conversations between therapists and patients, and then we analyze these conversations really in detail, but really in detail. Like the transcription of one sentence often takes like 8 hours or something, and it covers like over one page. So it's an extremely detailed transcription that we make of conversations, and when you make such transcriptions, you start to become aware of the extreme subtlety, and you start to see how sublime in-person conversations are. People react in-person conversations in less than 0.2 seconds to each other. You can compare it to our reaction time in traffic, that's more than 1 second. So it's 5 times faster than in traffic. And like for instance, if one person stops speaking in a real conversation, then the other person will typically start speaking in less than 0.2 seconds. And that will even happen if the first person stops speaking in the middle of a sentence. So if the sentences he uses are incomplete, if he stops in the middle of a sentence, then the other person will start speaking in less than 0.2 seconds, which shows that it has nothing to do with a kind of a rational anticipation on the basis of the syntax structure or something. No, it's not that. We feel when someone will stop speaking, and we almost immediately start speaking if the other stops speaking, usually, not always of course, but usually. And like that shows that is just the reason is that people who talk with each other in the real world, in an in-person conversation, are constantly connected at a physical level. The bodies of the people who talk with each other constantly resonate with each other. Like the muscle tensions constantly imitate each other without knowing it, unconsciously, immediately. The muscle tensions are the same. If we listen to someone who speaks, we will constantly imitate internally the tensions on his face, in his body, even the same neurological centers will be activated. So that is the reason we unconsciously we perfectly feel what's going through the other's mind and soul when we speak with someone, and that's the reason why we can so perfectly anticipate For instance, the moment where someone will stop speaking. And it's exactly this resonance creates like a kind of symbiosis. We feel together, we feel unified with the other when we talk with each other. And that actually satisfies one of the first and foremost longings of the human being, the desire to merge with another human being, to feel together. And it's that feeling, when we digitalize a conversation, when we have an online conversation, there is always a certain delay in the transmission of the signal. There is always, we don't see the body of the other entirely, we cannot choose the perspective, and so on. There are numerous differences which make that this resonance disappears. And that's the reason why if we talk for a long time online, that we feel exhausted, and that it is really a relief when we can talk with someone in person. Patrick Leary once articulated in a very nice way on Twitter. He said, what's so exhausting about digital conversations is that they put us constantly in the presence of the absence of the other. We are talking to someone and our bodies constantly feel the absence of the other. They feel that they cannot reach the other, that they cannot resonate with the other. And our bodies constantly try to connect with the other, and they can't. It's constantly disturbed. And it's this constant attempt to connect with the other, this failure to connect with the other, that exhausts us and that makes us feel exhausted in our body. And so that's one difference. That's one example of how technology, at first sight we always think that technology connects us to each other, and to a certain extent that's true. It allows us to exchange information with persons all over the world, so that's true. But at the level of the more profound, more physical and more human connection, it destroys this connection. So, and that's one of the problems. And that almost all, I give several examples in my book, in an unexpected way, almost all mechanical and technological advancements destroy something at the level of the connection with our world. It doesn't mean that we have to stop with every kind of mechanization or industrialization of use of technology, but you have to be aware that it comes with a price, and that's what we are not now. We constantly believe that all technological progress, for instance, will make our lives easier, and we are blind. We don't see that the more progress there is, the more depression we have, the more anxiety, the more and so on and so on. The more people feel exhausted, mentally exhausted, the more people suffer from burnout and so on. It's only one aspect of the problem, but it's a very important one. Believe me, it's an extremely important one. It's one of the major factors that play a role in the emergence of mass formation and totalitarianism. If you read the Frankfurter Schule, Hannah Arendt, and several other authors, they all mention it, even in the beginning of the 20th century already, that it is the social atomization, the fact that more and more people feel disconnected and lonely, that makes them fall prey to mass formation. And in the end, that makes totalitarianism exist.
And in other words, that's what they want.
You know, that's always a good question. I think in a certain way, this happens spontaneously. Every time someone invents a certain mechanical device that makes our life easier, most people just want it. So in one way or another, we are all enslaved. We all want to use technology. We all applaud when there is a new mechanical advancement, and that's only normal. But and at the same time, we think it makes our life easier, but we don't see that it also destroys something of the core of our existence as a human being. So I think it happens in a spontaneous way. As soon as modern science emerged and mechanical science emerged, and the first mechanical devices were constructed and the first technology was used, immediately people wanted to have it, they wanted to use it, and so on. And in this way, a new elite was created. At the same time, the population was a certain psychological state developed in the population, which made them vulnerable for mass formation. And parallel to that, at the same time, a new elite emerged. A new elite which represented this mechanistic thinking. And it is this elite, in the beginning of the 20th century, the masses, the population, was in a terrible state. There was much more anxiety, free-floating anxiety, frustration and aggression than before. There was much more lack of meaning-making, much more loneliness and social and disconnectedness. And at the same time, the elite started to develop an impressive propaganda and indoctrination machinery. If you read the works of people such as Lippmann, Trotter, and Bernays, who are considered the founding fathers of modern propaganda and public relations, they will exactly describe why they developed this propaganda and indoctrination. They all stressed that the masses could not longer be controlled by their leaders. They said the politicians, the ancient leaders, the noblemen and the clergy, they imposed their will to the population, and they just said it will be like that, and you will obey. But with the emergence of the modern democratic systems, this was not possible anymore. The political leaders had to be elected by the masses. So in a certain way, they became the followers of the masses, not the leaders. They had to try to find out what the masses want and then try to give it to them, or otherwise they wouldn't be re-elected. So these founding fathers of propaganda all realized that the politicians couldn't lead the masses anymore, and hence that there was a risk that he would fall prey to the irrationality and the destruction, the destructivity of the masses, the destructive instinct of the masses. And that's why they believed that they urgently had to develop propaganda and indoctrination. They said we cannot lead the masses anymore in an overt way, so we have to manipulate them and mislead them. But what they forgot was that everyone who tries to lead the masses falls prey, is hypnotized by the masses himself, and he becomes as irrational, as destructive, as egoistic, and so on as the masses. And that's exactly what happened you could clearly see that people like Bernays started with good intentions, but after a few years they started to use all their propaganda and all their indoctrination to manipulate, cheat, to become rich, to disrupt democratically elected governments, and so on. And that's how the monster of totalitarianism emerges. On the one hand, the masses, on the other hand, an elite, which believes that it is its holy duty to manipulate the masses, and which falls prey to its own all kinds of unethical motivations. I believe that's organically how the problem of totalitarianism started. It all starts with the delusional belief that rational understanding should be the cornerstone of our lives. From this follows an excessive mechanization, industrialization of the world and use of technology. From this mechanization, industrialization and use of technology, a new elite is created, an industrial, mechanical elite which has a materialist view on man and the world, which believes that the man is merely a biological organism which should be manipulated in a biochemical way and so on, which can be controlled with chips and surveillance and so on. That's the elite that develops, and on the other hand you have the population that more and more suffers from lack of meaning making, isolation, free-floating anxiety, frustration and aggression, exactly, which ends up exactly in this psychological state that makes it vulnerable for indoctrination propaganda. That's a strange, it's wonderful actually, if you look at it from a certain distance, how everything in a harmony, in a kind of synchronic way develops. While the elite develops its propaganda and indoctrination machinery, automatically the population is moving to a state where it becomes more vulnerable to this indoctrination propaganda. First, so this happens spontaneously, but of course, the elite might also create this intentionally. It's perfectly possible. Like, it's perfectly possible that there are certain people with a lot of power who know that if they make people use even more technology, that they will become even more vulnerable for indoctrination propaganda, that their psychological state will get even worse, will deteriorate, that they will become even more passive, that they will even become less resilient to propaganda and indoctrination. Why not? It's possible. It's perfectly possible. I'm very sure that on one hand there is a spontaneous process. That's definitely. There is a spontaneous process, but probably there is also an intentional manipulation of the population and an intentional a plan to, or an intentional attempt to make them more vulnerable. And then once the population is in this state, lack of meaning making, social disconnectedness from nature and from the social environment, lack of meaning making, a lot of free-floating anxiety, frustration and aggression. That means anxiety, frustration and aggression, which is not connected to a mental representation, in which people are anxious, frustrated and aggressive, but they don't know what they feel anxious, frustrated and aggressive for. That's typical. This free-floating anxiety, frustration and aggression, that's the perfect state for manipulation and propaganda. If under these conditions you distribute a narrative through the mass media repeatedly that provides an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, all this free-floating anxiety, which is very aversive, because if anxiety is not connected to a representation, if you're anxious but you don't know what you feel anxious for, you're completely out of control and you're looking for an object of anxiety. And in that case, if there is a narrative distributed in the mass media which provides this object of anxiety, all this free-floating anxiety easily connects to this object of anxiety, and people become willing to participate in a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety. For instance, lockdowns to deal with the virus, concentration camps to deal with the Jews, witch hunts to deal with the witches, crusades to deal with the Saracens. It's always the same. The first step of mass formation is the coupling of all free-floating anxiety to a certain representation of an object of anxiety, and then the participation in a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, which always equals an attempt to channel, to direct all the frustration and aggression to that object of anxiety. And if this happens, this is the first step, then the second step is, because so many people at the same time participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, they feel connected again. They stop to feel lonely. They fight this collective, heroic battle with the object of anxiety, feel connected again. It is as if their life makes sense again, as if there is a new kind of meaning making, and that leads to this new enthusiasm, this new enthusiastic solidarity, in which everyone participates in the same collective rituals, like the corona measures, the mask wearing, the vaccination strategies, psychologically had the function of rituals. And ritualistic behavior is always behavior which is pragmatically meaningless and which demands a sacrifice of the individual, through which the individual shows that the collective interests are more important than the individual interests. And that's why the measures can become as absurd as they want. A certain segment of the population will never wake up, because these measures, the more absurd they become, the more they function as a ritual. And that's exactly what people want. They want, without knowing it, new rituals, which makes that they can forget about themselves as these miserable individuals and sacrifice their lives for something that transcends it, namely this new collective, this mass, this totalitarianism. That was so typical for totalitarianism, this blind willingness to sacrifice their lives for the system. So that's, of course you could say, what's the problem with mass formation? There is new solidarity. So people felt lonely, now they are connected again. They suffered from lack of meaning making, now they have meaning again in their lives. What's the problem? Yes, there is a problem. This new connectedness, this new solidarity is never a solidarity of the individual with the collective. It's always a solidarity. It's never a solidarity of one individual with another individual. It's always solidarity of every individual separately with the collective. And in the end, if mass formation lasts long enough, all the solidarity is sucked away from the bonds between the individuals and invested in the bonds between the individual and the collective. Meaning that the solidarity with the collective becomes much, much more stronger than the solidarity with the individuals. And that's why you arrive, in the end, in a state where a mother reports her son to the state because she thinks he doesn't show enough solidarity with the state. That's a tragedy of mass formation. It starts from loneliness, it's rooted in loneliness, but it creates even more loneliness. Before the corona crisis there was a lot of loneliness. After the corona crisis there was even much more loneliness. And the corona crisis is not over yet, by the way, but now you see that people who stay at home here in Belgium, people don't visit theaters, theaters anymore, they don't go to school anymore, universities are empty, pubs are empty, people stay at home. All social bonds are destroyed through the mass formation. And that makes them vulnerable. for the next mass formation, which might be even more intense and more destructive.
Oh, I see. What you have described, actually, to be honest, I can understand by personal level, because there was once a period I went through some kind of depression myself, and so like this unknown fear that I had, but I want some reason, and without intention, my mind will find a reason what this fear comes from, where does this fear comes from, and then I try to connect and I will look for reason, but actually this feeling and the reason that I found does not connect, but it feels like it connects, and the problem keeps going forward, and then the problem becomes even bigger. So what you're saying is that like it's a human mechanism that we always seek for happiness, and our mind always try to protect our minds, but this mechanism is used against every one of us, and then instead of giving us the opportunity to become happy or solve this problem, they will, in the face, it looks like the problem solving, but it's the evil face. And the last question, it's been really interesting, and I think the time has been running up, but if I may. So recently, I heard a story about a father, and I think this happens to many people. So there is this problem within a family. There is young kids who got accepted to the university or the new job, and they wanted to go forward for the new future. They get job or go to school, but this organization requires them to get vaccine. But those kids do not want to give up their dream, but at the same time, their parents worried about their health. And this infighting causing family drama, and people, especially for the parents, they are thinking, how can they take their kids away from this system and protect their life, and at the same time they want their kids to be happy. How would you advise those parents? In other words, how can we pull those people out of sort of cult or this mass formation psychology?
That's very difficult. It's very difficult. Like Gustave Le Bon, who wrote this wonderful book, The Psychology of the Crowd. Psychology of the Crowd, yes. That's the title of the English translation. He said that when a mass formation emerges, people who do not fall prey to it will typically try to wake the people up who are in the masses. They will see the absurdity of the beliefs of the masses, and they will try to show them, like, look, what do you believe in, or what are you doing now? It's absurd what you do. And Gustave Le Bon said, they typically will not succeed in waking them up. Mass formation is a kind of hypnosis. It's exactly the same, it's identical. The process of mass formation is exactly the same as a process of hypnosis, in which all attention is focused on one point, and in which the rest of reality seems to disappear in the background, seems no longer to exist. So it's exactly the same as hypnosis. It's a very strong mechanism. And it's very difficult to wake people up from it. But, he said, the people who speak out should not be disappointed, because it's not because you don't succeed in waking them up that your speech has no effect. Your speech constantly disturbs the process of mass formation and makes sure, if the people who do not go along with it continue to speak in a quiet and sincere way, they will constantly disturb the mass formation, and they will prevent the mass formation to go to the ultimate stage in which the people in the masses start to commit atrocities. So that's just the main message of my book at the tactical level. Continue to speak out. We have to continue to speak out, even if nobody wakes up. We have an effect. We disturb the mass formation. We have to continue to speak out. And in the case of a parent and a child, well, it's just very hard. I know so many parents who try to prevent their children from getting jabbed, but they couldn't. There is no other option than to accept that. and to, I think so, I don't see another option, and still continue to speak out and to talk to your kid and try to make it aware, like, okay. And it doesn't make much sense to really try to stubbornly to convince them, because that won't work. You might even have the opposite effect. But just from time to time, just saying, like, look, okay, that's how you look at things. I take a different perspective. I see it differently, and I will tell you how I see it, and then just leave it, and you will have had an effect. If it will have been enough to prevent them from getting vaccinated, that's another question. But yeah, I think we live in times in which we have to accept certain things, no matter how painful they are, how extremely painful they are.
Mm-hmm. I see. So no matter what we feel, the impact of how we are speaking up looks very small, but it's collectively it's doing great fight against what's coming like, in the end. Oh, I see. Okay, thank you very much, and I would like to ask you more questions, but I hope that my channel, many Japanese people are watching, and also the people all over the world, who especially Japanese people living in the world. And your book is available currently in Dutch and English?
Dutch, English and Italian at the moment, and it's being translated also in German, Russian, Hungarian, Bulgarian, Korean, I think. And probably some other languages, but I don't remember exactly.
Wow, so many languages that it's hard to memorize everything.
Yes.
So hopefully your book will come out in Japanese translation too, and we would like to keep continuing learning from you, and understanding what's been done to us is very important, I think, to protect ourselves too. So thank you very much for your great work, and I hope to read many more great books from you.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.